Swamp Thing has an interesting history. It begins before we begin. That is to say, we begin on issue 20, which wraps up loose ends from the beginning of the series. And then, in issue 21, the anatomy lesson, the saga of the Swamp Thing begins properly. In autumn of 1970, Len Wein lived in Leviton, New York, writing short mystery stories for the editor of the House of Mystery and the House of Secrets. In April 1971, the House of Secrets issue 92 came out, featuring Swamp Thing. DC's publisher at the time, Carmine Infantino, asked Len Wein and his partner Bernie to turn their short story into an ongoing series. In August of 1972, Swamp Thing issue number 1 was a hit. But after 10 issues, Bernie left, and soon after, Len left too, not having fun without his friend. Len left for Marvel, creating some of the most iconic characters of all time, while DC tried to keep Swamp Thing going with writer David Michelin. It ended shortly after. However, Wes Craven, of A Nightmare on Elm Street fame, horror icon extraordinaire, decided to turn Swamp Thing into a feature film. 10 years later, in 1982, after several years at Marvel, having created Wolverine and other X-Men, Len returned to DC to write and to edit. He went to Jeanette Kahn, DC's publisher at the time, to recommend a Swamp Thing comic to accompany Wes Craven's film. Jeanette agreed, despite Len not wanting to return as writer. Len instead asked Martin Pasco, who later convinced him to join the field of animation writing by getting him to write his own episode of Batman the Animated Series. For the artist, he went with a graduate of Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art, Tom Yates. For the first 19 issues, Swamp Thing was introduced to a whole slew of new characters, new foes, including General Avery Carlton Sunderland, who uncovered the secrets of the Swamp Thing, leading to a rebirth of the Swamp Thing. After issue 19, Marty Pasco left as the head writer, and Len struggled to find a writer of the caliber that he was looking for in America. So he looked over into the United Kingdom and found an up-and-coming British author who had work in 2000 AD and Warrior, none other than Alan Moore. He agreed to write, though he wanted to make some changes, as long as Len approved. When doing a book a month became too much for Tom Yates, 2 other artists joined the fray, Steve Bissette and John Tottleben. Volume 1 includes 8 issues, entitled Loose Ends, The Anatomy Lesson, Swamped, Another Green World, Roots, The Sleep of Reason, A Time of Running, and By Demons Driven. Through these 8 issues, Swamp Thing comes in contact with a number of horrifying monsters in their own right. Whether it's the Floronic Man, who wishes to act on behalf of all the plants of the world and seek revenge on humanity for its genocide of nature, or the Monkey King, who haunts the dreams of children in an orphanage, or a rhyming demon by the name of Etrigan, or even the horrible General Avery Sunderland. Swamp Thing, simply put, is what remains of Alec Holland, a scientist that was researching a way for plants to regenerate damaged tissue. He was sabotaged and an explosion took his life. When he fell in the nearby swamp, so did the chemicals from his formula, thus infusing his consciousness into the greens of the swamp. Swamp Thing is not Alec Holland. Swamp Thing is a plant trying to remember what it was like to be Alec Holland, what it was like to be human. At the heart of Swamp Thing, the story is both a body horror and existential horror about a being that has to come to terms with the non-existence of its internalized humanity and asks, what do we do when we lose our sense of self? What are we left with? Where do we go from here? The existential question of meaning is explored in Swamp Thing, as Swamp Thing works to find out who he is now, and to give himself new meaning, new purpose in life. When Swamp Thing loses his sense of self after being shot and experimented on in Avery Sunderland's company, he takes his revenge on Sunderland and returns to the swamp in a sort of catatonic state. The lies he believed about himself and told himself must be denied, though he falls into an existential crisis when he returns to the swamp and loses form, while his consciousness loses the memories of Alec Holland. While he's not entirely human, he recognizes he's not fully a plant anymore, so he decides to redefine himself. Each story in this volume builds on top of these ideas as Swamp Thing comes to term with his swamp thingity and explores what it means to be human by exploring his newfound self.